At 8:47 a.m., Daniel Hayes was worth $47 million, sitting in a glass office high above downtown Seattle, reviewing numbers that had only ever moved in one direction. By 4:12 p.m., he had nothing left, no house, no company, no reputation, and by the end of that same day, the man who once controlled every decision in his empire was being investigated for something far worse than financial loss. This is the story of how everything he built disappeared in a matter of hours, and how the signs were there long before that day ever began. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel Hayes was the kind of man people pointed to as proof that hard work still paid off. He grew up in a middle-class neighborhood outside of Denver, raised by a father who worked construction and a mother who balanced two jobs to keep things stable. From an early age, Daniel understood that if he wanted more, he would have to create it himself. By the time he reached his early 30s, he had already made a name for himself in the world of finance, building a firm that specialized in high-risk, high-reward trading strategies that attracted investors looking for faster growth. His company expanded quickly, managing millions in client funds and generating returns that outperformed traditional firms. Investors trusted him, not just because of the numbers, but because of the confidence he carried. Daniel didn't hesitate. He made decisions quickly, adjusted faster than competitors, and believed that hesitation was the one thing that destroyed opportunity. That mindset turned him into a millionaire, but it also pushed him into areas most people avoided. What many people didn't see was how much pressure Daniel was under to maintain that level of success. Each quarter came with expectations that grew higher, and every gain made the next one harder to achieve. Behind closed doors, Daniel had begun using more aggressive strategies, leveraging larger portions of capital to amplify returns. It worked, at least in the beginning, and as the profits increased, so did his belief that he could manage any risk that came his way. The morning everything changed started like any other. Daniel arrived early, coffee in hand, reviewing overnight market movements. There were minor fluctuations, nothing unusual, and his positions appeared stable. But around mid-morning, a series of unexpected shifts began to ripple through the markets he was heavily invested in. At first, it looked like a temporary reaction to global news, something that would correct itself. Daniel had seen similar patterns before, and each time, he had come out ahead. But this time was different. As the hours passed, the losses didn't slow down, they accelerated. Positions that had been profitable for months started collapsing within minutes. Daniel began moving funds, attempting to stabilize the situation, but each decision only exposed him to more volatility. The leverage that once multiplied his gains was now multiplying his losses at a speed he couldn't contain. By early afternoon, the firm's accounts were under intense pressure. Automated systems began triggering margin calls, forcing assets to be sold off to cover the growing losses. Daniel tried to intervene, calling his team, issuing rapid instructions, but the scale of the situation had already exceeded manual control. Millions were being wiped out in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. At 4:12 p.m., the final positions were liquidated. The accounts that once held tens of millions were reduced to nothing. Investors who had trusted him were now facing devastating losses, and within minutes, the consequences extended far beyond the financial damage. Reports were filed, regulators were alerted, and questions began to surface about how such a collapse could happen so quickly. As the evening approached, Daniel's world continued to close in around him. Calls from investors turned into demands for answers. Legal teams began reviewing transactions, searching for any indication that the losses were more than just a failed strategy. The same confidence that once defined him was now being questioned, and the decisions that built his success were being examined from a completely different perspective. By nightfall, Daniel was no longer just a man who had lost money. He was at the center of an investigation that would determine whether his actions crossed a line he never believed he would approach. And as he sat alone, watching the city move on as if nothing had changed, one realization became impossible to ignore. Everything he had built wasn't taken from him in a single moment. It was lost through a series of choices that, at the time, felt completely justified. The collapse of Daniel Hayes was not just about markets or money. It was about control and the illusion that it could never slip away. Because in the end, The difference between holding everything together and losing it all can come down to a single day, a single decision, and the belief that you're always one step ahead of the consequences. So what really happened in those 7 hours between 8:47 a.m. and 4:12 p.m., when Daniel Hayes went from controlling $47 million to having nothing left? Was it simply a streak of bad luck, a perfect storm of market conditions that no one could have avoided? Or was there something else, something deeper that had been set in motion long before that day began? And why are there people, including some who once worked closely with him, who believe Daniel Hayes may have played a role in his own collapse? To understand what happened, you have to look beyond the surface. At the time, Daniel Hayes was the driving force behind a fast-growing financial firm known for aggressive trading strategies and unusually high returns. The company had built a reputation for moving faster than traditional institutions, adapting quickly to market changes, and delivering results that kept investors coming back. On paper, everything looked strong. Revenue was climbing, client portfolios were expanding, and confidence in Daniel's leadership remained high. But beneath that image, there were details that didn't fully align. Internal reports showed increasingly complex positions, layers of financial exposure that only a small group of people truly understood. Emails between senior team members revealed moments of concern, brief exchanges questioning whether certain risks were getting too large, too concentrated. Yet each time those concerns surfaced, they were addressed quickly, often dismissed with reassurance that everything was under control. The event that changed everything didn't begin with a single headline or announcement. It started quietly, with a series of movements inside the company's financial systems that only became visible once it was too late to reverse them. Transactions that seemed routine at first began to connect in ways that raised serious questions. By the time outside observers started to notice, the damage had already spread across multiple accounts, affecting not just Daniel Hayes, but everyone tied to his firm. And as investigators would later piece together the timeline, one thing became clear. The collapse wasn't just about what happened during those 7 hours. It was about the decisions made long before, decisions that would come back into focus as people began asking a much more difficult question. Was Daniel Hayes caught off guard by events he couldn't control, or did he see the risks and choose to move forward anyway, believing he could manage the outcome until the very end? Daniel Hayes was not supposed to become the man people would later question. Long before the headlines and investigations, he was simply a kid from a quiet part of Colorado who understood one thing very early in life, that no one was going to hand him anything. His father worked long hours in construction. His mother stretched every dollar to keep the household steady, and from the outside, there was nothing about Daniel's upbringing that suggested he would one day control millions. But what he lacked in advantage, he made up for in focus. He was disciplined in a way that set him apart, the kind of person who tracked his time, measured his progress, and refused to accept average as an outcome. By his mid-20s, that mindset had already started to pay off. Daniel entered the financial world at a time when markets were becoming faster, more complex, and more competitive. While others hesitated, he leaned in. He studied patterns obsessively, spent nights analyzing data most people ignored, and developed strategies that allowed him to move quickly when opportunities appeared. It wasn't long before he realized he could build something of his own, something that didn't rely on traditional systems or slow-moving institutions. And that's exactly what he did. The company Daniel Hayes built operated in a space where precision and timing meant everything. It focused on high-frequency trading and leverage positions, areas where small advantages could generate massive returns if executed correctly. At first, it was just a small operation, a handful of people working long hours with limited resources. But the results spoke for themselves. Early investors saw returns that exceeded expectations, and word began to spread. Within a few years, the firm had grown into a serious player, managing millions in assets and attracting clients who were willing to take on more risk for the possibility of higher rewards. Inside the company, Daniel developed a reputation that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. Some described him as brilliant, a strategist who could see opportunities others missed. Others called him ruthless, pointing to the way he pushed his team beyond their limits and made decisions without hesitation. And then there were those who found him unpredictable, someone who could shift direction without warning if he believed it gave him an edge. To Daniel, none of that mattered. What mattered was winning, and as long as the results continued, everything else felt secondary. But as the company expanded, so did the complexity of its operations. The strategies that once felt manageable began to involve larger sums of money, more intricate positions, and tighter margins for error. Employees who worked closely with Daniel started to notice subtle changes. Meetings became shorter, decisions became more concentrated, and information was shared with fewer people. There was a growing sense that Daniel preferred to operate alone, even in situations where collaboration might have reduced risk. Some of his team members would later recall moments that didn't seem significant at the time, but felt different in hindsight. A senior analyst once mentioned that certain positions were becoming too large relative to the firm's overall capital, only to be reassured that everything had been accounted for. Another employee described how Daniel would occasionally override standard risk controls, insisting that he understood the situation better than the systems designed to manage it. At the time, these decisions were easy to justify because they often led to short-term gains. But they also introduced a level of exposure that wasn't always visible on the surface. Outside of work, Daniel's life reflected a different kind of imbalance. The success that brought him financial freedom also created distance between him and the people around him. Relationships that once felt stable began to weaken as his priorities shifted almost entirely toward the business. Friends saw less of him. Conversations became shorter, and over time, the circle of people he trusted grew smaller. Even those closest to him noticed a change, a sense that he was becoming more guarded, more focused, and less willing to let anyone fully understand what he was dealing with. One person in particular, someone who had been part of his life during the earlier years, would later describe a shift that stood out. She said there was a point where Daniel stopped talking about the future in the same way. Instead of sharing plans or ideas, he became more reserved, more focused on maintaining what he had already built. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but it was noticeable enough to raise concern. When she asked him about it, he would brush it off, insisting that everything was fine and that the pressure was simply part of the process. As the months went on, the gap between appearance and reality continued to grow. From the outside, Daniel Hayes was still seen as a successful entrepreneur leading a thriving company. The numbers supported that image, and there was little reason for anyone to question it. But internally, the structure was becoming more fragile. The strategies that once provided consistent returns were now requiring more precision, more timing, and more confidence than ever before. And with each adjustment, the margin for error became smaller. What made the situation even more complicated was Daniel's belief that he could handle it. He had built his career on making difficult decisions under pressure, and that history reinforced his confidence. Every time a risk paid off, it strengthened the idea that he understood the system better than anyone else. But that same confidence also made it harder for him to step back, to question whether the level of risk he was taking was sustainable in the long run. Looking back, it's easy to identify the moments where things could have gone differently. The warnings were there, the concerns were raised, and the patterns were beginning to shift. But at the time, none of it felt urgent enough to force a change. The company was still growing, the returns were still coming in, and Daniel Hayes still believed he was in control of everything that mattered. But just weeks before everything collapsed, something changed. At 7:30 a.m., Daniel Hayes woke up to what should have been another controlled, predictable day. He followed the same routine he had built over years: a quick workout, a brief scan of overnight market movements, and a quiet moment with coffee before stepping into the flow of decisions that defined his life. Nothing about that morning suggested what was coming. His positions were stable, his accounts were active, and the systems he trusted showed no immediate signs of stress. If anything, it looked like a day that would pass without incident, just another step forward in a long streak of calculated wins. By 9 a.m., something began to feel slightly off. It didn't announce itself as a crisis, just a series of small disruptions that didn't quite fit. A message appeared referencing a transaction Daniel didn't immediately recognize, larger than usual and executed faster than expected. Around the same time, a call came through from a number he knew well, but he didn't answer it right away, assuming it could wait. Moments later, another notification appeared, then another, each one adding a layer of uncertainty to what had started as a normal morning. At 10:15 a.m., the first real crack appeared. Market positions that had been steady began to dip, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. It wasn't the kind of movement that immediately triggers alarm, but it was enough to draw attention. Investors started reaching out, asking questions about minor fluctuations that didn't seem to align with the firm's usual performance. Daniel responded the way he always had, calmly, confidently, assuring them that temporary shifts were part of the process. But as he monitored the numbers more closely, it became clear that this wasn't behaving like anything he had seen before. Within minutes, the situation began to accelerate. Internal systems started generating alerts, not because of a single failure, but because multiple thresholds were being approached at the same time. Messages appeared across internal channels, team members asking for clarification, trying to understand why certain positions were reacting the way they were. Data streams updated rapidly, numbers shifting faster than anyone could process in real time. Daniel moved quickly, issuing instructions, attempting to adjust exposure, but the speed of the changes made it difficult to stay ahead. By 12 p.m., the controlled environment Daniel had built was no longer holding together. Confusion spread across the team as transactions began to stack on top of each other, some initiated automatically, others triggered by earlier movements that hadn't fully settled. Funds were shifting between accounts at a pace that made it difficult to track where the real exposure was. Systems that had been designed to manage risk now seemed to be amplifying it, reacting to conditions that were changing by the second. For the first time that day, Daniel realized he wasn't fully in control of what was happening. At 1:30 p.m., the pressure reached a different level. Calls came in from board members, voices more direct, more urgent than anything Daniel had heard before. They wanted answers, clear explanations for movements that no longer made sense from the outside. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing his words, offering reassurances that the situation was being handled. But even as he spoke, the gap between what he was saying and what he was seeing continued to grow. The confidence that once came naturally now required effort, and the room for error was closing fast. By 2:45 p.m., everything began to lock down. Accounts were flagged, restrictions were applied, and access that Daniel once had without question started to disappear. Legal notices were drafted, some already filed, as investors reacted to losses that were becoming impossible to ignore. News outlets began to pick up fragments of the story, early reports hinting at a sudden and unexplained collapse. The narrative was forming in real time, and Daniel was no longer controlling it. The system he built, the one he believed he understood completely, was now moving beyond his reach. And then, the one thing Daniel Hayes never expected happened. At 4:12 p.m., it was over. Every major position had been liquidated, every account that once held millions reduced to nothing. The numbers stopped moving because there was nothing left to move. What remained was silence, the kind that follows something too large to process immediately. But even in that moment, one question refused to settle. Was this the result of a series of unfortunate events, a failure of systems under pressure, or something else entirely? Because as the details began to surface, people started to ask whether this was fraud, a targeted attack, an inside decision that went too far, or a calculated risk that finally collapsed under its own weight. In the hours that followed the collapse, Daniel Hayes was no longer operating as a businessman trying to recover losses. He was now at the center of something far more serious. By the next morning, federal financial investigators had stepped in, along with regulatory agencies tasked with overseeing market activity at this scale. What initially looked like a catastrophic failure quickly turned into a case that demanded answers. The speed of the collapse, the size of the losses, and the number of accounts affected raised immediate concerns that this wasn't just a market event. As investigators began to examine the records, the first layer of evidence pointed to something unusual. Large amounts of money had moved through multiple accounts in a very short period of time, some transactions following patterns that didn't match the firm's typical behavior. There were gaps in the data, moments where activity seemed to accelerate without clear justification. Even more concerning were internal communications that appeared incomplete. Certain messages were missing, others had been deleted, and timelines that should have been straightforward now required reconstruction. Daniel Hayes was called in to provide his account of what happened, and for the first time, he found himself in a position where control was no longer his to define. Questions came from multiple directions, Each one focused on understanding not just what happened during those 7 hours, but what led up to them. Investigators wanted to know who authorized specific transactions, why certain safeguards were bypassed, and whether anyone else inside the company had knowledge of the risks that were being taken. Daniel answered carefully, aware that every word carried weight far beyond the conversation itself. As the investigation expanded, several possible explanations began to take shape, each one pulling the narrative in a different direction. Some pointed to a business partner who had access to key systems, suggesting that an internal decision may have triggered the chain reaction. Others raised the possibility of an external breach, a coordinated effort to exploit vulnerabilities in the firm's infrastructure at exactly the right moment. There were also those who believed the truth was simpler, that Daniel Hayes himself had made a series of decisions that, when combined, created a situation no system could withstand. Each theory brought its own set of details, its own version of events that seemed plausible when viewed in isolation. But as more information came in, the contradictions became harder to ignore. Certain transactions didn't align with the timeline of a potential breach. Internal access logs raised questions about who was present in the system at critical moments. Financial records showed patterns that could be interpreted in more than one way, depending on where you started looking. It was a puzzle where every answer seemed to create another question. The public narrative followed the same uncertain path. Media coverage shifted from reporting a financial collapse to exploring the possibility of misconduct. Headlines focused on the scale of the losses, the speed of the downfall, and the growing list of unanswered questions surrounding Daniel Hayes and his company. For those watching from the outside, it became increasingly difficult to separate fact from speculation. Each new detail added tension, but none of it provided a complete explanation. And through all of it, one critical detail remained unresolved. For all the missing funds, the unusual transfers, and the conflicting theories, there was still no clear answer to the one question that mattered most. What actually triggered the collapse at the exact moment it happened, and why did it unfold in a way that left Daniel Hayes with no chance to stop it? Because until that detail was understood, everything else remained uncertain, and the truth behind that night stayed just out of reach. As the investigation moved forward, the focus slowly shifted away from external theories and toward something much closer to Daniel Hayes himself. It wasn't a single piece of evidence that changed the direction, but a pattern that became harder to ignore the deeper investigators looked. The transactions, the timing, the decisions made in the days leading up to the collapse all pointed to one uncomfortable possibility. This wasn't just something that happened to him. It was something he had a hand in setting in motion. Records revealed that Daniel had taken on a position far larger than anyone outside a very small circle realized, a level of exposure that went beyond what his investors believed he was managing. It wasn't disclosed, and more importantly, it wasn't hedged the way it should have been. At first, the decision appeared calculated, a high-risk move designed to generate returns that would push the company to another level. And for a brief period, it worked. The numbers improved, the pressure eased, and no one questioned the results. But then the market shifted in a way Daniel hadn't anticipated. Losses began to form, small at first, manageable enough that he believed he could correct them before anyone noticed. Instead of closing the position, he adjusted it, moving funds, increasing exposure, trying to recover what had been lost. It was a decision that made sense in the moment, especially for someone who had built his career on staying ahead of the curve. But that one adjustment set off a sequence of reactions that quickly moved beyond his control. What investigators uncovered next made the situation even more serious. In an attempt to stabilize the losses, Daniel had redirected funds from other accounts, temporarily covering gaps that were beginning to form. It wasn't intended to be permanent, at least not at first. The assumption was that once the market corrected, everything could be restored without anyone noticing. But the correction never came. Instead, the pressure increased, and each move required another to support it. The system became dependent on itself, holding together only as long as everything moved in the right direction. It wasn't one mistake. It was a chain reaction, each decision built on the last, each adjustment creating a new level of risk that had to be managed in real time. By the time the market shifted sharply on that day, the structure Daniel had created was already stretched to its limit. When the losses accelerated, there was no buffer left, no margin to absorb the impact. Everything collapsed at once, exposing the full extent of what had been hidden beneath the surface. The consequences followed quickly. Formal charges were brought forward as investigators concluded that the movement of funds and the lack of disclosure crossed into territory that could not be ignored. Daniel Hayes, once seen as a disciplined and calculated leader, was now facing accusations that would define how his story was remembered. His reputation, built over years of success, was dismantled in a matter of days, replaced by questions about judgment, responsibility, and intent. For those who had worked with him, the outcome was difficult to reconcile. The same qualities that drove his success, his confidence, his willingness to take risks, his belief in his own ability to manage any situation, were the very things that led to his downfall. And as more details came to light, one realization became impossible to avoid. The collapse of Daniel Hayes was not caused by a single catastrophic event, but by a series of decisions that, when combined, created a situation where failure was no longer a possibility. It was an outcome waiting to happen. In the final stages of the investigation, just when it seemed like every detail of Daniel Hayes' collapse had been uncovered, one more layer emerged that shifted everything again. It wasn't found in the major transactions or the large positions that had already been analyzed, but in a series of smaller records that had initially been overlooked. These records showed that in the days leading up to the collapse, Daniel had quietly moved a portion of funds into an account that wasn't directly tied to the company's main operations. It wasn't a large percentage compared to what was lost, but it was enough to raise a new question. Why would someone who believed they could recover everything set aside anything at all? At first, it looked like a precaution, a decision made under pressure to create some form of protection in case things didn't go as planned. But as investigators examined the timing more closely, the pattern became harder to dismiss. The transfers didn't happen after the losses began. They happened before. Before the market shifted, before the systems started reacting, before anyone else inside the company had any indication that something was wrong. It suggested that Daniel Hayes may have seen the possibility of collapse earlier than he admitted, and instead of stepping back, he chose to move forward while quietly preparing for an outcome he never spoke about. That detail changed how everything else was viewed. The risk he took was no longer just a calculated move that went too far. It became something more deliberate, a decision made with the awareness that the consequences could be severe. Whether he believed he could still avoid it, or simply chose to take the chance anyway, became a question that no one could fully answer. But what remained clear was that the line between control and loss had been crossed long before that single day unfolded. In the end, Daniel Hayes didn't just lose his company or his wealth. He lost the one thing he relied on more than anything else, the belief that he could manage every outcome if he moved fast enough and thought far enough ahead. And as everything around him collapsed, that belief disappeared with it. Because in the end, it wasn't the money that destroyed him. It was the one decision he thought he could control. And now the question turns to you. If you were in his position, seeing the same risks, making the same choices, and believing you could still come out ahead, would you have done anything differently? So now that you've seen how everything unfolded for Daniel Hayes, from the rise to the collapse and the decisions that connected it all, the story leaves one final question that no investigation could fully answer. What do you think really happened that day? Was Daniel Hayes a victim of a system that moved faster than anyone could control, or was he the one pulling the strings until everything finally gave way? And if you think this story is shocking, the next one is even darker.